My name is Aria Kane and I do not ask for mercy because mercy is a currency the powerful spend on themselves while starving everyone else. I was raised on that lesson, watching my father hand over his life to a company that smiled in glossy ads while they cut the engineers' safety budgets, and that man in the suit who spoke at ribbon cuttings wore my family's ruin like a badge. The world called those collapses accidents and the men who ordered them philanthropists, and I was supposed to accept the vocabulary of loss. That suited them, but grief is an architecture and I learned to build from the stones they threw at me. I learned how to read numbers the way other people read poems, because numbers hide truth the way silence convinces people there is nothing to see. In ledgers and invoices the rotten decisions are written with a sloppiness that only pride can hide, and when I sat in fluorescent rooms stacking paper into a map, I saw the routes money had taken away from schools into offshore accounts. I saw promises converted into memos, and when my father asked questions the men who should have answered leaned in and gave him a phrase that was meant to be an ending: liability mitigated, matter closed, cause of death undetermined. I did not scream into microphones then because microphones were not listening to people like us, so I learned to whisper into records instead, and the whispers were facts: every tiny exception, every odd vendor, every trust fund drawer with a signature that belonged to a charity and a skeleton in the ledger. I collected them like kindling until I could set a fire that would burn the corporate mask off a face that had learned how to look like a salvation. There is a particular kind of hate that is patient, and patience is not weakness, it is a weapon forged by remembering. I practiced small violences first: an anonymous email that redirected a quarterly payment, a polite internal note that misfiled a memo so it did not reach the audit team, a quiet suggestion to a junior analyst that prompted him to misread a number on a report. These were small and soluble, and they taught me that a big machine breaks by an accumulation of small failures introduced by someone with a plan. He was the reason my teeth became knives, the man in the center of the firm, and then the campaign, and then the party: Senator Hale, silver hair, a handshake that read like a contract clause, a man whose smile could apologize and acquit at the same time. To his donors he was a savior. To my family he was a verdict. He had managers who handled tragedies like spreadsheets, turning bodies into footnotes and buying silence by funding clinics with the same hand that profited from unsafe sites. And when the young men and women died on concrete floors that were supposed to hold their lives, the headlines offered condolences while the ledgers offered profit. I infiltrated the margins of his world not because I am clever but because I was invisible. An assistant who filed his mornings and answered calls. They never look closely at the ones who appear grateful to be near power. I learned to make myself forgettable so I could watch the choreography of corruption without interruption. And while he spoke of integrity at podiums, I had access to the back end: private schedules, off-the-record minutes, receipts from dinners where decisions were colored as policy. There is a time in revenge when you understand you can either burn a house down or remove its foundation. I chose the foundation. I started by dismantling trust, turning his lieutenant's loyalties into doubts, placing innocuous seeds that sprouted suspicion: an invoice here that linked a charity to a shell company there, a photograph of an engineer's safety report with a sticky note showing a handwritten override. Each tiny reveal nudged a mouse in his expensive maze to panic, and men who thought they owned the night began to miscount their allies. I am not interested in theatrics for spectacle's sake. Spectacle is for those who crave applause. I wanted structural collapse, the sensation of a man who had banked his immortality on other people's silence suddenly realizing that silence is optional, that it can be turned into noise. So I curated leaks like a composer placing notes until the melody made the whole city listen. When the first article landed, an obscure blog with a journalist who smelled a pattern and had the courage to publish it, the board called emergency sessions and the PR teams worked feverishly through the night. They polished statements until they shone like alibis, and their words were armor, but armor leaves cracks, and I fed shrapnel through those cracks, small verification files that looked like mistakes but were proof enough to invite more scrutiny. And once one outlet began to pry, the next could neither deny nor ignore the procession of otter facts. Men like Hale have consultants and lawyers whose entire talent is to shape the narrative, and by time is their ally, but time frays when the current is strong enough. When regulators in different jurisdictions start putting parallel pressure on accounts that used to be untouchable because the web of transactions is international and ugly, and the more eyes that look the more hidden corners leak, and that is when panic becomes measurable. They started to suspect leaks not as a pattern but as a war. They hired private intelligence cameras multiplied, and a man who had never watched his back learned to sleep uncomfortably because he had the bad sense to let others craft his safety, and those people betraying him were now the ones I had slowly cultivated. The quiet drivers who had secrets, the clerks who owed favors, the analysts who used to smile at him because they were hungry and frightened and later were hungry and useful to me. When the first aide resigned with a whispered apology because she could not reconcile the directives she had signed with the memos she had read, the office trembled, and in the tremble investors smelled risk and began to ask their own costly questions. They called for audits, and the auditors found anomalies in places where there should have been none. And then it became not a single scandal but a pattern, and patterns cannot be smiled away. My methods were surgical and often cruel because destruction is not clean, collateral lives are hurt, and wars you wage against monsters. An old friend of mine who had trusted me with a laugh and a cigarette was framed by them in the tabloids as the source of a leak he did not commit, and I watched his life erode under the smear because power will always strike at tenderness first to prove it still rules. That is a part of the ledger you carry forever. But the city had an appetite for drama, and once the first headline turned into a lead segment, the machine that adores spectacle did the rest. Pundits debated, donors panicked, and those who invested in his projects calculated their exit strategies while his hand trembled every time the phone brightened. And this was my work, turning everyday instruments of wealth into the kindling of his ruin. There was a night I followed him into a private fundraiser where chandeliers screamed wealth from the ceiling and men wore their reputations like medals. I stood among them not as a woman of consequence but as a shadow in a silk gown, and when I caught his eye across the room I felt centuries of wrongs convene in that glint, and I knew then that my choice had to be public enough that his apologies would not be credible because he had practiced plausible deniability for decades. So I arranged for a dossier to arrive at a public forum with enough corroboration to make denial absurd. I leaked server logs to independent auditors, recorded conversations of his proxies who thought the microphones were off, and placed visual proof of bribes into the hands of a foreign journalist whose outlet could not be pressured easily, and I timed it to a shareholder meeting so his face would appear on screens around the world as the documents loaded. When the files went live, his smile dissolved into something small and animal, and his voice, which had once drawn applauses, lost its practiced ease and fragmented, and the moment the boardrooms emptied and the donors receded, I watched him reach into the past like a drowning man clutching at air and find only fingerprints of his own making. He tried to fight back with legal barrages and with manufactured statements and with the sort of righteous anger that reads well on television, but law is a language he had used to disguise crime, and now that same language trapped him because the volume of evidence I released made it impossible for a single counsel to spin a single narrative, and regulators began to ask not just for explanations but for documents with teeth, and the teeth began to bite. The retaliation grew uglier. His allies hired men who deliver consequences in concrete ways. My phone was traced, my accounts were scrutinized. And one of the people who had believed in me as a friend was arrested on fabricated charges meant to lure me out, and when the headlines broke I felt the old hunger twist into sorrow, because you cannot wage a righteous war without facing the fact that the weapons wound those who handle them too. I adapted, because adaptation is a survival skill, moving our operations through opaque channels, introducing false trails and closing them, setting traps for the hunters who came for my trail. And when one private investigator chased the wrong lead, I made sure he found a lie that served us and not him, and the labyrinth of pursuit became their own undoing as they chased ghosts we created. The real pivot came when I discovered the deeper hand, a network of shell companies and foundation trustees, and a patron who preferred to sign donations while his operatives forged tragedies. A man with no public profile but whose accounts carried line items that explained why contractors cut corners and why inspectors looked the other way. Removing one tyrant does not change a system built by many hands, and so my work shifted to exposing the entire scaffold, not just the face painted on it. I sent records to foreign regulators, to investigative journalists with immunity, to watchdogs who keep lists and publicize them, and I enlisted those who had learned to hate him the way I did. Workers dismissed mothers whose children were orphaned by negligence. The people who had no status and therefore nothing to lose, who showed up with testimonies so raw they made headlines feel inadequate, and when their voices combined with the documents the chorus drowned out his paid choir. The tide turned as if the city itself decided to wake up. Board chairs who had once nodded at his plans suddenly found their phones ringing with investors who had seen the data and were not reassured. The philanthropic arms that had accepted his money quietly asked for returns, and for a while his name floated in gossip columns like a carcass on a river, and the stench was political death. And then the moment I had to choose between symbolic victory and permanent eradication arrived. I could have forced him out of power and moved on, but I had learned the hard lesson that men like him spawned successors who were their crimes like heirlooms. So I chose a final act that would leave no straightforward error in action, public enough to be undeniable and private enough that it could not be disavowed by denials and glossy statements. I orchestrated a hearing that would be televised, arranged witness testimonies that could not be impugned, and supplied a single incontrovertible ledger that linked his private accounts to collapsed sites and to the families we had been tracking for years. And when the cameras rolled, he faced the people he had harmed, and the difference between commentary and a human face was immediate and brutal. They called it a fall from grace, tabloids called it drama, the campaign machines called it a scandal. But when he sat in that hearing and could not produce a plausible answer for a single person who had been crushed under his decisions, I felt something shift in the city, because we had not simply exposed a man, we had given witnesses standing and evidence that did not beg for faith, it demanded action. He was convicted in time that felt like slow rain, and the public watched as a man reconstructed in press conferences dissolved in courtroom testimony. And yet when the sentence came, I did not feel a clean victory, because long before the gavel fell I had chosen a cost, and that cost had been paid in lives like my friend Jess and so many small collapses we could not rescue. And I learned a cruel mercy: justice consumed me as well as him. There is an ending in every story where light defeats darkness and you close the book, but life keeps turning pages and the next chapter is rarely neat. So I left the city with his name on the tongues of pundits and his foundations closed, but with a ledger in my hands of everything that had happened, and a knowledge that systems rebuild with new hands and new manners. That is why I did not stop angry or satisfied. I continued, because vigilance is the only thing that keeps rot from returning. This is not a plea for sainthood, and it is not a boast, it is a confession and a map. Because I learned the truth about power, it does not apologize, it rewrites. And only relentless truth-tellers can unmask it, and they pay with solitude and loss. But if silence rebuilds tyrants, then noise is a duty, and noise is what I chose to give. My name is Aria Kane, and if you remember one thing, it should be that the city belongs to the people who will not let the powerful rebrand their crimes as accidents. So hold recorders in your pockets, ask awkward questions, support those who testify, and do not mistake a polished face for a moral one, because I will not.